Thanks heaps. Good to be with you this weekend too. Really enjoyed it. And lots of kids. The next 10 years of your church are going to be very interesting, I'd say. That's a good sign. I've sort of hybrid this talk. I did the same last year where I thought I'll get 3 talks done and I'll see how I'm tracking, and then the 4th one might have to shift around a little bit, which I've kind of done again. So, which is why I have my computer here, because there's some stuff I wanted to use from something else that I'd said somewhere else. But I'll read some words from 1 Thessalonians, because I thought I'd think, do you have an Instagram account for your church? No? Oh, you're not on board. No, that's not true. No, look, I'll give you the story context of that is, so where we met at the school that my daughter and my daughter went to, my son still goes to, we're meeting there in the school. And it's a good school, it's a big school, we meet in the theatre, arts theatre, but we're very, what I call, plain rap church. You know, it's in an area which is probably not one of the highest socioeconomic areas in Perth, but across the road from the school is a church called Dream Builders. And that just says everything, doesn't it? Dream Builders. I call it Dream Crushers. And in that school, they have a whole youth team. Now, I think they are there's a bit of smoke and mirrors going on in that place. A lot of smoke, like smoke machine smoke. And there's a bit of smoke and mirrors. It's not as big as they would like to say it is, but they've got this youth team of very funky kids who come in on a Friday to the school, and they, in Pied Piper-esque, entice kids to their Friday night youth group. There's ice cream. And my daughter is a cynical so-and-so, and she's, yeah, so what? And it's like Dream Builders. And then there's Providence Church Midland, which is us, right? And then there was a building at a cafe in Midland. It's a great cafe, and it was owned by a church that sort of failed. The church, but the cafe is amazing, and the building is fantastic. And we have to move out of the school at some stage, and we would have loved that building, but we couldn't negotiate it right price-wise. And then there's a franchise church in Perth called Kingdom City, and they got that building the other week. The first plant in Midland, and their sign says, "You're never more than 15 minutes away from a Kingdom City church." Okay, you're never more than 15 minutes away from McDonald's either, but hey, do we want to go every day? So our life is between 2 very Instagram churches. You've got Dream Builders, and you've got Kingdom City, and you've got Providence Midland. Ka-chunk, 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 ka-chunk. That's what it feels like. And you think, what's our source of distinction? It feels like sometimes and you look at those things and you think, wow, they're out to get all our young people, and they're out to, churn people through. And what you'll notice in where we live is that people will move between churches and things like that. And you think, well, how can you even catch and stick people in church? And I've said to our guys, just hold your nerve. The people that are coming are going to come. The people that are going to come to consume and move somewhere else are going to do that anyway, so you don't need to put a lot of energy into it. Now, it hasn't actually been too much of a problem, because there's 160 of us, and our youth group was 5, and now it's 20, and we haven't even done any Instagram church for that. It's just relationship stuff. But I thought it's very easy to lose your nerve in a setting like you're in when you know that there's Dream Crushers, Dream Builders, Dream Weavers, whatever they're called, there, and then there's Kingdom City. You're never more than 15 minutes away from a Kingdom City church. In a way that church is much more like a milkshake. It's like smooth, it's been pureed for you so you can suck it down easy. I know it's being a bit harsh. Irony is, people have left those churches and come to us because they're burnt out from you've got to be up and the music's got to be amazing, and you've got to have it done this way at 8 in the morning, ready for that service, or 7:30 in the morning, ready for the service to roll at 9, and everyone's exhausted. So our main guitarist at our church, we don't have a big music team, was at that church and growing up. And it started as a church plant like ours in a back block building, and now it's Dream Builders, and whatever the word is. Just add dream and then anything you want at the end of it. And he said it was just too much. He could not sustain what they were trying to do because it just churned people through it. I thought, if you're going to be sustainable at the moment, you're going to have to find the place that's actually, realistic in what you're doing. And you've got to have to be known for something more than just 15 minutes away from the this or whatever it is. And I thought, well, what do you actually have to be known for as a church? How could you actually, if you were an Instagram church, what would your hashtags be? What would describe you as a church? And I think getting to know that is probably crucial to understanding who you are. I want to read some words from 1 Thessalonians and then talk a little bit about what the church in Thessalonica might have been hashtag Instagrammed about and how that might inform us. So this is 1 Thessalonians 1. Paul, Silvanus and Timothy to the church of the Thessalonians in God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Grace to you and peace. We give thanks to God always for all of you, constantly mention you in our prayers, remembering before our God and Father your work of faith and labour of love and steadfastness of hope in our Lord Jesus Christ. For we know, brothers, loved by God, that he has chosen you because our gospel came to you not only in word, but also in power and in the Holy Spirit and with full conviction. You know what kind of men we proved to be among you for your sake, and you became imitators of us and of the Lord, for you received the word in much affliction with the joy of the Holy Spirit, so that you became an example to all the believers in Macedonia and in Achaia. For not only has the word of the Lord sounded forth from you in Macedonia and Achaia, but your faith in God has gone forth everywhere, so that we need not say anything. For they themselves report concerning us the kind of reception we had among you, and how you turned to God from idols to serve the living and true God, and to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, Jesus, who delivers us from the wrath to come. And as I looked at that passage, I thought the Thessalonian church, even in the midst of a place where it wasn't even that Dream Builders was there and Kingdom City was there, it was that the culture was very harshly against them. If you read the story in Acts of how the church in Thessalonica began, there was a lot of pressure on them in the city. Paul comes into the city and shares the gospel, and he ends up getting kicked out. And everyone's, there's trouble for the church from day one. Yet it says here, we don't even need to tell everyone about you because everyone knows what you're like around the traps because you've been known for these things. It's like you went viral just on the basis of what it says here in the text. That's the things that you were known for. And I think that in a culture like ours where everything is flashy, to be known for some of the things that are written down here would be much better than being known 15 minutes away from this or Dream Builders or whatever it is. What should you be known for as a church? And it's interesting that this church itself, it says, we don't need to tell anyone because they know what you're like. And it says three things in particular. You turned to God from idols to serve a living and true God and to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, Jesus Christ, who delivers us from the wrath to come. And there's a sense there that three things they had. They turned, they served, and they waited. Turn, serve, wait. You think, is that enough to do for church? Just, I don't have to have Instagram account or anything like that. What would it mean to be a church that actually is a model to other believers? Because we look at churches and we go, that's the model church I'd like to be, or that's the model church I'd like to be, and the big speaker comes into town and he says, don't do everything I say, and everyone, don't do everything he says, And then you go and try it, and it's like, well, his church is 1,000 in America in the Bible Belt, and here we are in sort of Tasmania, and it doesn't translate across. And that can start to be quite crushing, I think, especially in an era where you can access information about other churches very quickly. How do you hold your nerve? And it says that they received the gospel with joy, even in the midst of great affliction. So they were putting up with this stuff in difficult times, but they turned, they served, and they waited. And it says they turned to God from idols. They turned to God from idols. And they turned from something to something. They were marked out in Thessalonica as people who said, we're actually not going to do what the Thessalonian life looks like. We're going to flip around and turn away from that. So you've got to imagine the context in Thessalonica. Everyone isn't just living little private spiritual lives. The way pagan idolatry worked in a city was that the whole of social life was gathered around the worship of idols. It wasn't sort of a sacred secular divide like we think today. It was if you want to be part of the social networks, if you want to be part of the clubs, if you want to be part of the guilds, all those sorts of things, all involved idol worship. You would go down to the temple and you'd put a pinch of, snuff on the altar to this god, and you'd sacrifice something for that god, and there's temple prostitutes, there's all this stuff. You can see why worship was fairly popular if temple prostitution was the form of worship that went on in those cities, and that's exactly what it was. And they had been involved in that culture, and they turned from it. They turned away from it. That immediately drains you of any social capital in the city. Suddenly, you have to engage with the people who've also turned away from it. You're not just doing your private devotions, you're actually together as a group that's seen as a little bit suspiciously by the rest of the culture, that you have turned away from the system that's actually running. And it also tells you that it says they turned to God from idols, that there's no such thing as not worshipping. We talked about this yesterday as well. One of the things you've got to realise as you live in the context that we're living in there isn't worshippers and non-worshippers. That's a category error. There are worshippers. Everyone's a worshipper. Everyone's worshipping something. And David Foster Wallace, if you've read anything he was an atheist author. I love these atheist authors that I'm quoting recently because they're all coming up with the idea that, hey, we are all worshippers, even us atheists. They recognise that they're putting their time and attention into something. And he says, he's dead now, he committed suicide. It was a few years ago. He was a great novelist and he had severe depression. But he did a commencement service at one of the swankiest liberal arts colleges in America called Kenyon College. And at this commencement service, it's all the bright young things. The commencement service doesn't mean the start of the year, it means the end of your degree and you're commencing life into the workplace. And so he's sending all these journalists, advertising gurus out into be the next generation of people who sell us stuff. And he said this in his talk: in the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshipping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what? To worship. And for the Thessalonians, that looked like an actual idol. Everyone was worshipping idols. And the Christians, the people that heard the gospel, they turned from that. They turned away from something that was the plausibility of their city. That's a huge thing to do. Just to do that and acknowledge that everyone's a worshipper and we're turning from that way of worship. And you think of the things that our culture worships: autonomy, choice for yourself. We were playing cards last night and 3 lines came up in the card game that would sum us up as a culture. Listen to your heart, wasn't it? Trust your gut. And what was the other one? Be true to yourself. and that's just for the sermon today. No, that's the card game. Listen to your gut. And so we're independent financially, we're autonomous in the things that we do. Sexual satisfaction is crucial. We've got the right to forge our own identities. That's the stuff that our culture worships. And we say as a church, we want to turn from the idols of the age to do things differently. That's a huge challenge for people in church, because it's very easy in a church to just baptize that stuff, especially autonomy, that you can do what you want, doesn't really matter. And we get this at church all the time. People come for 6 months and then they're gone. They ghost you. It's like your girlfriend ghosting you, they don't write, they don't call, they won't return any calls. Think, how did they come to our church for 6 months and then just go a week later and there's nothing? And that's just because that's built into how we are. The first thought about ourselves in our culture is that we are the consumer who controls what we bring into our lives, and we curate the things that make us feel good. Very hard to break that out of us as a system, because it's just the water we swim in. And David Foster Wallace starts his talk by talking about the 2 goldfish swimming around the bowl, and Grandpa Goldfish swims past. Hey boys, how's the water? They go, what's water? Because you don't know it when you're swimming in it. And as Christians, we come together and we meet to say, part of what we do is we're breaking the idols of our age of autonomy when we get together, even when we don't really want to, even when we're very different to each other. We're making choices that we don't get to decide who the people are we gather with. That's God's decision. And Thessalonica was no different. Those people were brought together not because of their common interest in idolatry or their common interest in the guild or the craft they were involved in. They were brought together because of Christ. And so that was what their primary identity was. And they turned from idols, it says, to God. And I think we're not immune from the independence streak. That's the hardest thing to break, I think, that when people become Christian and come to church, the biggest challenge I think they face is, I'm actually, not my own, because I'm bought with a price by Jesus, but I'm plugged into a body, and that makes a huge difference. And I think holding our nerve in that in the culture at the moment is a massive thing to do, just to break that idol, to say I'm turning from that autonomy where I get to decide for myself everything all the time. Now the flip side of it is what I talked about the other day, where no decision you make is allowed to be autonomous, which is my experience in the UK, that everything, I couldn't make a decision without people saying, and I think there's a fine line to walk there. You say, we're not autonomous, we are a body, but we still, I'm not going to be telling people, here's the kind of car you can buy or here's the house you can live. That's a cult. And we're not going there. So we walk this fine line of showcasing to people that we live where we serve each other in a way that's costly, but we don't sort of overreach that and tell people what they do, what they have to do. So the thing about turning from something to something else is that for the Thessalonians, it came at a cost. And when Paul came to the cities that he came to and preached the gospel, one of the things they said was, here are those people in our city who've turned the world upside down and they've come here. You will upset this upsets the social order. Church upsets the social order. It turns the world upside down. It says the primary focus is not just you, or it's not you, it's about serving others. And you can see in the great toilet roll fiasco of 2020, the primary thing has been to serve ourselves. Our first instinct is, I'll have those 50 toilet rolls. And it's reflexive. And Paul says, said of Paul, here are those men who turned the world upside down. So what would it look like in Margate to just flip Margate upside down a little bit? What's in Margate or what's in your part of Hobart that kind of needs a little bit of flipping? And I'd say it's pretty much uniform across the Western world. Margate and Hobart's no different from, New York. It's just by degree in how we think and move and have our being. And I think part of what we want to do in church is to be so different that we flip the world upside down that people go, that's weird. That's really weird, but it's intriguing. Because as I said the other day, people are looking for meaning, identity, and purpose, and they're not sure where to find it in the culture at the moment, what it actually looks like. It turned the world upside down. So what would it be known, what would it be like to be known as the, if you had a hashtag Instagram following, you'd be known as the church that sort of turns the world upside down. Because lots of the big flashy stuff is, we're here to make a difference. But often that difference isn't really that different. It just looks like a baptized version of the culture. And what we want to be is something different to that. And you've got a lot of kids in this church at the moment. There must be, you know what I think about kids? If they got their act together, they could take us, right? Because there's so many of them, but they're just all over the... Let's go and win and foment rebellion. Oh yeah, there's a butterfly, and so they're too distracted to take us, but there's enough of them. You're going to model to them what it looks like long term. And I think the joy I've seen in our church is us over time modeling to kids who, when we started our church, were 10 and now they're 18. And you don't think that 8 years in your life is a lot, but that 8 years in their life is massive for what you've taught them and what they've seen in you. And are you any different to what the world is actually offering them? I think that's absolutely crucial. The second thing they did in Thessalonica, it says they turned, it says they served. They served a living and true God. They turned from idols to serve... forget about that, Siri. They turned from idols to serve a living and true God. In the context of that, it says a living and true God from idols, which would say that idols were dead and false. But idols present themselves as living and true. But they turned from dead, false idols to a living and true God. And David Foster Wallace says this is in his commencement service, which is really a cutting down of the whole cultural narrative that these people have believed at university, and they've been taught that they're going to go out to make a difference, you know. This is what he says. He goes on to say about worship. An outstanding reason for choosing some sort of God or spiritual thing to worship is that pretty much anything else you worship will eat you alive. If you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough. Never feel you have enough. It's the truth. Worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally plant you in the ground. Yay! You know? That's a commencement address. In other words, what he's saying is the things that you think are serving us are actually, we're serving them. That's the problem with idolatry. Because the first time that you sort of sacrifice something to the rain god and it rains, you think, wow, I pulled that lever and it worked. And the thing with idols is you have to keep pulling the lever harder and harder for less and less outcome, until eventually you're giving everything to it and it's doing nothing for you. That's the way idolatry works. First time you pull the lever, rain. Second, pull a bit harder, rain. Eventually you'll sacrifice everything on that altar and it will give you nothing. That's the way idolatry is working. And you see it in our culture. You just see that people worship those things, beauty, sexual allure, autonomy, and they become our masters, and we're fooled into thinking that they're serving us when we're actually serving them. And that contrasts, doesn't it, with the true and living God who served us, not by causing us to die, but by dying for us. And that changes everything, because that shapes what you then do in response. We love him because he first loved us. Nothing we do is to cajole God to get what we want, which is what idolatry is about. How can I game it to get God to do what I want? Now I say that, but we actually do that with God. How can I game this system to get the God of the universe to do what I want? And he goes, it doesn't work that way. How could you game it to get God to do what you want when he sent his son to die for you when you didn't deserve it? There is no gaming of it with God. He's a living and true God. Only idols are things that you game to try and get the response. When you model that to a culture where there's a price to pay for everything, I think it's incredibly liberating. Incredibly liberating. And our kids are watching that. They're seeing what happens. And if we're not modeling that in the culture, the rest of the culture isn't showing them that at all. They're saying it's all quid pro quo. You get out of it what you put in. And the gospel says, actually, that's not quite true. It's not true. You're getting something undeserved. You're getting grace. And that comment by Douglas Murray that I quoted from The Madness of Crowds, people don't even know where they could get redemption or who could give it to them. People are scared. And unfortunately, you can baptize that with church and run a very worldly, idolatry-driven understanding of God in church. And that's the most dangerous place to do it, because you can make it look really good, really religious. And I think what we've found in our church is that a couple of young people said to me, here's what we're known for. We're known for being the church that you can come to if you've been somewhere else and it's a safe place to be. Now, people in my church generally don't read my blog, which is interesting. And everyone thinks that our church, who does read my blog, is this high, hip, funky kind of hipster kind of place where everyone's very culturally aware of everything all the time. That's not true. It's just a bunch of people doing life together and loving each other. And for me, that's been because we're saying this is about grace. This is about the grace of God in a context where there isn't a lot of grace. And when there's a true and living God, he'll never lie to you because he's true, and he'll never lead you to death. He'll lead you to die to yourself, but the goal will be life. And I think sometimes the other thing too is we're kind of stoic. Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me, die to yourself. But he doesn't do it as that end in itself, because he says, whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel, they'll what? Gain their life. Great reward. Jesus isn't saying be stoic for the sake of it. He's saying, I will give you an even greater reward. It is reward. Die now, live later. Die now for greater life later. Our church systems have to almost have that in place as well, because our plausibility doesn't have to be bright and shiny and smoke and mirrors and 15 minutes away from the nearest Kingdom City. Not that I'm bagging out Kingdom City, I'm just saying we're not going to pitch ourselves that way. That's not what we're on about. We're not franchises. We're groups of people living in specific areas that need to know what it means to be a Thessalonian or know what it means to be a Hobartian. Is it a Hobartian? Hobartian. Hobartian. Who do you think you are? We're just from Perth. Yeah. Yeah. And the problem is the plausibility structures of our culture push well against that, don't they? You think, it doesn't feel that this is the true and living thing to do because it feels so lame. But underneath that, there's something better going on. So that's to turn and to serve. And the last one I had was wait. Wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, Jesus who delivers us from the wrath to come. I think it's interesting that kind of the idea that Jesus is coming back has kind of fallen off the radar in a lot of churches and theologies. And part of that is because life is so darn good now. Well, it is in Western Australia. I'm not so sure it is in Syria for the average Christian. They're probably waiting for something better than, what their next Instagram account's going to look like. And only 15 minutes away from being slaughtered. That's probably what it's like for a lot of Christians around the world through time and space. And so they're waiting for something more than the next great experience or the next building project for their church. And I was speaking in Sydney last year in this new job that I'm in, and I always feel like an imposter. I went to a thing called Bridge Street Fellowship, and I work in Bridge Street, which is next to the bridge. And so I always feel that way. I go with my big beard. I felt like the man from Ironbark, going to do the Sydney Toff, and I should have had my beard shaved off. But I went to this meeting on the 25th floor of this big building, and John Anderson was there, former Deputy PM. He's part of this network. He goes, Steve McAlpine, love your writing. I was like, a bit weird. But it was a banking sector. And I'm there, and I go, crumbs, I feel well out of my depth with all these people. And it was a great talk. It was an evangelistic talk to all these banking people. And there was a guy there, and he comes up to me, so what are you doing here? And I went, imposing, imposturing, that's what I'm doing. And I said, so tell me about your life. And he said, look, I work in the banking sector. Well, I can tell that. You're on the 25th floor in a suit. This room that we're in looked like the ballroom of the Titanic, and it had an actual telescope looking out the window across to the poor people. And he said, my wife suffers from severe depression, and both my sons have severe autism, so they go to a separate school, and I get my wife ready in the morning, and then I take the kids to different schools, and then I get into the city, and then I come home, and pick them up, and I do that again tomorrow. I just assumed that you were the guy whose life is all together with everything. and you're on the big six-figure salary. He's a Christian, and he said, "Oh, look, my hope is Jesus is coming back, because this is what the rest of my life's going to look like at the moment. I can't see a way past that." Well, that's a good reminder, isn't it? That even in the midst of all that Sydney toff, as we call it, there's a guy going, this can't be all there is, and it's not all there is, and my hope is that I can keep doing this, because one day I'm waiting for Jesus to come back, and the resurrection will fix that stuff up in a way that I can't fix, because stuff stays broken. And I think as churches, to admit that stuff stays broken as we wait for Jesus to come back is so liberating for people. Otherwise, because the only other option is play bright and shiny on Sunday morning. I think people are beginning to get sick of that, because it's just not, it doesn't work. And so when it says we're going to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, Jesus who delivers us from the wrath to come, there's two things at play there. It's that we're waiting for Jesus to come back, and that's kind of fallen off the radar. And I go to churches and I go, I wonder if there's a theology of that Jesus is coming back. Now, it's the weirdest thing in the world to believe that Jesus is coming back. If you work in a secular setting in the city, and they say, so what's your hope for the future on the interview? Well, I'm hoping that Jesus is going to come back one day, and there's going to be a new creation. He's going to put justice and righteousness, and and they'll be going, yeah, thanks, we'll call you. Yeah, and so it just seems weird to believe that, but it shapes everything you do. Because if Jesus is coming back to bring in justice, and you're in a workplace setting, you don't need to find justice now for you now. And if Jesus is coming back and it'll be a life of holiness, then it'd be good to start living holy lives now, I suppose, because the future's going to look like that. And if he's coming back to raise the dead, because he's been raised from the dead, then the grief that we experience now will be reversed. What does it say in Lord of the Rings? That all the sad things will be made untrue. That's what the resurrection's about. All the sad things will be made untrue. And that's where the joy comes in church. You can't manufacture that kind of joy through smoke and mirrors and sexy church, as I call it. And if we're the kind of communities that offer that reality to people who are broken and hurting and need something other than what this world can offer, that will be a good thing. To wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, Jesus who delivers us from the wrath to come. Now that last bit's a bit scary, Jesus who delivers us from the wrath to come, because it says there's a judgment coming to sort this stuff out. And it'd be a good idea to be on Team Jesus now, because there's a day coming where he's going to go, I'm going to sift this around and sort it out. And if you're living in Thessalonica at the time, you're the problem if you're a Christian. But a day's coming when the Thessalonica of the future, the redeemed Thessalonica, that you will be the solution, not the problem. You will be the ones who are vindicated. And I said it last year and I said it this year, and I've said it so many times, is that there's a great day of reversal coming that we don't fully understand and how it's going to play out. That Jesus says it himself, the things that humans love, God has no time for. The things that we value highly, says God just says, oh, that's not valuable. And our culture doesn't get that. And it leaks into us as Christians. So when we read the book of James and it says, if someone comes into your church who's well heeled, like the guy in Bridge Street, you fawn over him. Yet if the person who comes in who looks shabby, you kind of despise them. And we can do our own versions of that. And I heard someone say, a minister friend, well, he's a theological lecturer, said the worst thing he ever heard in a church, and this is how we do it, is that the pastor had said, I'll only try to spend time with the young guys coming to the church who I think are going to be the influencers. Do you think Jesus went around going, if people come to me, I don't want the lady who's been bleeding for how many years to come to me. I want the influencers to come to me so maybe we can trend or go viral. Jesus comes to the ones, and in fact they come to him, who've been bleeding for 12 years, who's on the outskirts and an outcast. And that's the way it works. And it's just hard to get into that mindset. So one of the things I've enjoyed about our church is saying that there's a couple in our church who are getting married this year, and I can't see how they are so awkward together. Sometimes they don't even sit together in church. They're socially awkward. They're really just kind of struggle street people, and he is in his early 30s. He's very quiet, fostered out, long-term foster kid, then adopted, doesn't know his real parents. And he's getting married to this girl who's a little bit spiky, and they're just awkward. Yet, up on Facebook, the 3 good-looking young men in our church who are real movers and shakers are sitting there taking a photo of all 5 of them having dinner together. They're not ashamed of them. They just gathered the waifs and strays, and yeah, these young guys are cool, and they've got cultural cash. You know, they're the kind of guys that people want to hang around. Yet the gospel's changed them enough that they just they just gather the waifs and strays and have dinner with them. And to see them on a Sunday, these young guys in their 20s who are doing medicine and all that, just sitting with the old guy in his 70s, who's a bit awkward as well, and just chatting with him. And one of them came up to me and said, all the cool people come up to me, he said, I'm just scanning the room looking for anyone that's not being spoken to, and I'm going to go to them. I think, that's the gospel. Nothing in you would make you want to do that, other than the fact that Jesus is the one who will reverse everything one day. And for us, and I say to my daughter, don't worry that we didn't get that funky building. Don't worry that all the kids in the school are being dragged over to Dream Builders on a Friday night for, Smoke and Mirrors youth group. Don't worry about that, because long term, that will not sustain people. It's not cool when you're 25 to think about youth group at 18. And by the time you're 25, enough bad things have happened between 18 and 25 that you start to think, I'm pulling that lever, but it's not working exactly the way it needs to. My wife has found that people coming to her saying, at 18 I thought it was all going to work out, and here I'm at 25, and those years haven't been as kind to me as I thought they would be. That's the way it is. We've got an opportunity to be known for something more than the building we've got, the Instagram account, the photos and things like that. And I think, I've been with you 2 years now, and I've loved your church, because it feels like our church. It feels like just a bunch of people who got their own issues, got to deal with those issues, but you love each other, and you're a body together. And I think, don't underestimate the power of that going into a very broken culture, because the cracks are starting to show. If the atheists are writing books about there's something wrong, if even Richard Dawkins is now saying Christianity's got something to offer the culture, the new atheists went for a while, and then now people are going, I'm not so sure. Just hold your nerve. Just keep doing this. Get up tomorrow and do it again. Get up tomorrow and do it again, because we're waiting for Jesus to come back and vindicate it and say, the city of Hobart that is part of the age to come, God's people, is what the future looks like. That's going to be the Hobart of the future. You are the Hobart of the future. And that's an encouraging thing to think.